Hi, I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm the CEO of JW3, London's Jewish Community Centre and the UK's only Jewish arts and culture venue of its kind. Sadly, as you know, we've had to temporarily close our doors at the moment. We've got to think about people's health and safety, and we're listening to government advice. But just because we've stopped doing what we normally do in the way that we do it, it doesn't mean we have to completely stop what we're doing and what we're best at. And that is to increase the quality, variety and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond. So we've got some treats for you. We are going to put on a whole load of our digital archive that we've been building up over the last 6 years of some amazing events. We're going to make them absolutely free of charge to you. And whilst you sit down with a cup of tea and put your feet up and watch this amazing thing you're about to see now, our team are going to be planning for a whole bunch of events that we're going to put on digitally over the coming months. For now, this one's on us, it's free. But you know, everything that we do costs money. And at the moment, we don't have the same income streams that we've got. So if you can spare a few pennies, a few shekels, if you can click donate online, that'll be really wonderful. We'd be so grateful for it. If you can do that, that's great. But either way, please sit back and enjoy. We'll see you again soon.
This year is the centenary of Arthur Miller. He was born 100 years ago next month, October the 17th. And he was arguably, please do say, anyone at the back who has any trouble hearing, do sort of wave a hand or something and I will raise the volume as much as I can. Miller was surely the greatest American playwright of the 20th century, that is, of the American century. Other candidates, I suppose, might be Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, David Mamet in more recent years. Arguably, he was the greatest playwright anywhere in the 20th century. Again, there are, of course, rivals and so on. But if you think of the classic pantheon of Miller plays, All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, A View from the Bridge, Broken Glass, that is a very impressive output. Approximately 20 radio plays written mostly as a young man in the 1930s and 1940s. Over 30 stage plays. Screenplays, best known for The Misfits, but also a TV play that he wrote in 1980 called Playing for Time with Vanessa Redgrave, set in a concentration camp. He wrote a well-known novel, a very important novel called Focus, published in 1945, about anti-Semitism in America. He wrote 2 books of short stories, I Don't Need You Anymore, 1967, and Presence, published in 2007. He was a major public figure, especially well known for his stand against Mccarthyism during the 1950s. His play, The Crucible, has always been taken as a thinly veiled attack on Mccarthyism. He spoke out also against the Vietnam War. As president of Penn, he played an enormous part in standing up for writers and playwrights and poets faced with dictators and torture. He was married to one of the most famous Hollywood stars of all, perhaps the most famous, Marilyn Monroe. And there's the sheer longevity of his career. Born in 1915, he started writing at college in the mid-1930s, and his last play was produced in 2001, almost 65 years later. He lived through the Depression. He wrote about McCarthyism and the Holocaust. He spoke out against Vietnam. It is an extraordinary career. And what I want to do is 2 things. Firstly, relatively briefly, to look at Miller's life. And secondly, to look at some of the central themes and moments in Miller's work in their context. Miller was born, as I said, in 1915 as Arthur Asher Miller in what was then called Southern Harlem. He was the second of 3 children of Isidore and Augusta Miller. Isidore Miller came from Austro-Hungary, and Augusta was born in New York, but to Austrian Jewish parents. He had an older brother, Kermit, and a younger sister, Joan. His father he described in his memoir, Time Bends, as a man who has built one of the 2 or 3 largest coat manufacturing businesses in the country at the time, and who cannot read or write any language. His parents, significantly, Well, from the wave of immigrants who came to America in the 1980s, there was, as you know, a great wave of immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe and the Russian Pale to America, to the American East Coast in particular, between about 1880 and 1924, till the anti-immigrant legislation put an end to that until the post-war period. And if you think of any great American intellectual, cultural, scientific figure, any Jewish American cultural, intellectual, scientific figure from that period, from the 20th century in other words, they will either have come over as immigrants during that period, or they will be the sons or daughters of immigrants from that period. He was, as he says in his memoir, brought up among Jews until the age of 20. Our family, he wrote, knew almost no Gentiles. His family lived at 35 West 110th Street near Columbia University. He was part of that extraordinary American literary generation, and this is terribly important, of Bernard Malamud. Remember, Arthur Miller was born 1915, Malamud born 1914, Saul Bellow born 1915, the American literary critic Alfred Kazin, born 1915, the American literary critic Irving Howe, born 1920, Joseph Heller and Norman Mailer, born in the early 1920s. It was an extraordinary generation without parallel in American history, without parallel in the history of the English-speaking world, without parallel in the history of Jewish literature. He went to public school, what Americans call public school, what we would call a state school, in Harlem between 1920 and 28. And in 1923 he saw his first play with his mother. Interestingly, all cultural references in his memoir, but from his childhood, are to do with his mother. His father was illiterate, not remotely interested, whereas his mother was passionate about theatre, was passionate about books and reading, and Miller identified very strongly with his mother. Then in 1928, his father's business began to struggle and the family moved to Brooklyn. And then comes the Wall Street crash. And without question, 1929 and the Wall Street crash was the key moment of Miller's childhood, as it was, of course, for a whole generation. And part of the appeal of so much of Miller's best work, particularly Death of a Salesman, is that it really is one of those extraordinary works that speaks to and for a generation. He wrote, "They were ruined by it," the crash, just destroyed by it, and very quickly. My father had a business that probably employed 800 to 1,000 people. It was one of the largest coat companies in the United States, and in a period of probably a year or so, there was absolutely nothing left of it. The trauma of that moment, its impact on his family, particularly his father, haunts Miller's life, haunts the way he writes, both in terms of the subject matter and also his sense of the suddenness of catastrophe, the fragility of lives and communities. And it's, in a way you would think, well, of course, this was such a massive moment for America. It was such a massive moment for the West. And yet if you take an exact contemporary like Saul Bellow, it is worth asking that Bellow barely mentions the Wall Street crash, barely mentions the Depression, because in Bellow's characters, they're sort of young Chicagoites in their teens, even pre-teens or early 20s, who are sort of young hoodlums on the make, street kids on the make. And for them, it's just an adventure. It's a great lark. For Miller, it is absolutely, whatever else it is, the Depression was not a lark. It was the key moment of his childhood, arguably of his life. He went to Abraham Lincoln High School after this point, and in the early 1930s he saved up $500 in about 2.5 years working in various jobs. He writes his first short story in 1932 and graduates from high school in 1933. He then goes to college from 1934 to 38, still during the Depression. He goes to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. 2 points I'd like to make about this. First of all, the generation of the golden age of Jewish American literature, whether we're talking about poetry, drama, novels, short stories, film writing, were college educated. Their parents, almost without fail, were not. They were the first generation in their family's history to go to college. Secondly, almost none went to Harvard, to Yale, to Princeton, to Columbia, to NYU. Lionel Trilling was the first Jew to teach English literature at Columbia University in the late 1930s. Norman Mailer spent most of his life trying to recover from the fact that he'd been to Harvard. It was such an astonishing feat for a Brooklyn boy. And the reason is quite straightforward, which is anti-Semitism. There was a panic throughout the American Ivy League and through the East Coast university system about all these smart, young Jewish boys coming from, where were they coming from? In huge numbers, who couldn't be turned down on grounds of ability, so quotas, very firm quotas, were introduced. It is one of the most fascinating stories of American 20th century culture. While at Ann Arbor, he wrote his first play, and indeed, during these years, he writes a whole number of plays and wins awards for them. He graduates in 1938, and he joins the Federal Theatre Project in New York to write radio plays and scripts. And then he writes his first play for Broadway. He's written something like 19 or 20 radio plays by now. And he writes a play called The Man Who Had All the Luck in 1944. It closes after 6 performances, including 2 previews. It was a disaster. In fact, I think even the word disaster doesn't quite do justice to what a failure it was. And bear in mind, he's now written quite a number of plays, as well as his 20 or so radio plays. He is now a married man. He's married the first of his 3 Gentile wives, Mary Slattery, Catholic noch, and is already a father. He's almost 30. And this setback, I think, could have crushed many other playwrights, young playwrights, in this situation. And he did something rather remarkable, I think, and it is perhaps the second key moment in Arthur Miller's life. He goes back to the drawing board. He reads Ibsen. He studies Ibsen. He studies Ibsen's structure of tragic drama. A hero, quite an ordinary middle-class man, has a guilty secret from his past. And the play will methodically, ruthlessly expose this guilty secret from his past, bring him face to face with what he has done, and it will destroy him. And when we talk about Arthur Miller's kind of drama, Arthur Miller's kind of tragedy, and the extraordinary explosion of work that he will produce over the next 11 years or so, between The Man Who Had All the Luck and View from the Bridge in 1955, during which he wrote his greatest work. It is the influence of Ibsen and what he drew from Ibsen that is absolutely at the center of this work. In 1945, he also published his novel Focus, And he carries on with his sort of radio plays and so on. And then comes his breakthrough play in 1947, All My Sons. As I say, during this sort of long decade, from 1947 to the early 60s, we have all his best plays: All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, A View from the Bridge, his most famous screenplay, The Misfits, his famous marriage to Marilyn Monroe, and his appearance before HUAC. And in 47, All My Sons appears, directed by Elia Kazan, who was a famous figure in American theatre at the time and in American cinema, one of the major directors in both areas, who also becomes notorious a few years later for naming names to the House of Un-American Activities. And this play ran for 328 performances. That's for almost a year. It won Miller his first Tony Award, and it was filmed the next year. It was such a success. It was filmed with Edward G. Robinson in the main role as Joe Keller, and Burt Lancaster as his son Chris. So it had a huge impact. At around the same time, he writes his first screenplay. Arthur Miller writes his first screenplay, The Hook, which is based on his research into the longshoreman world of the dockyards of Brooklyn, which fascinated him. He spent years researching this area. And in some ways it fed into what later became On the Waterfront. Not that he wrote On the Waterfront, but this preoccupation with corruption and gang warfare and organized labor and those who try to stand up to corruption and the gangs was a fascinating piece of work. It also fed into his later play, A View from the Bridge. His son is born, his second child, and from the proceeds of his first play and the film rights, he buys a farmhouse in Connecticut as a vacation home and buys a new home in the city. Then in 1949, and one's got to remember the speed at which this happens, many great careers, when you look at it, you sort of think, well, these guys were around forever, so of course they had great careers. But actually, many of their great careers were condensed into 10 or 12 years or so. And this is absolutely true of Arthur Miller. 1949, Death of a Salesman, wins the Pulitzer Prize. Again, directed by Elia Kazan, with Lee J. Cobb, if that name rings any bells, as Willie Loman, and Arthur Kennedy as Biff. It opened at the Morosco Theatre on Broadway on the 10th of February 1949 and ran for almost 750 performances. That's 2 years. It won a Tony Award for Best Author, Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and has been revived famously by George C. Scott in 1973, Dustin Hoffman, 1984, Brian Dennehy in 1999. Many of you may well have seen Anthony Sher playing Willie Loman earlier this year in London. And it was filmed in 1951 with Frederick March as Willie Loman, a slightly unlikely piece of casting in a way. And sort of rather fits the moment with a number of other crypto-Jewish characters, I would say, like Willie Loman, Paddy Chayefsky's Marty, the lonely butcher, the central characters of Herman Wouk's The Caine Mutiny, and Joseph Heller's hero in Catch-22. There is a sort of strange moment of transition, which we'll come back to, in which all these kind of Jewish-ish characters appear in major works, films, plays, novels written by Jewish writers. Augie March would be another in Saul Bellows' novel around this time. And then 1950, he produces an adaptation of Ibsen's play An Enemy of the People, which was produced in New York. In 1951, Death of a Salesman is filmed, and he meets Marilyn Monroe. And then in 1953, he produces his response to McCarthyism, The Crucible. It premiered on January the 22nd, 1953 at the Martin Beck Theatre on Broadway, starring E.G. Marshall in the main role. Miller felt the production was too stylized and cold, and the reviews for it were largely hostile. Nonetheless, the production won the Best Play Tony Award, and a year later a new production succeeded and the play became a classic. In 1954, the growing tension between Miller and Huac came to a head when he was refused a passport by the American State Department to attend the opening of the Crucible in Brussels. In 1955, A View from the Bridge, produced as part of a double bill initially in New York with another play, A Memory of Two Mondays, opened on the 29th of September at the Coronet Theatre, Broadway, ran for almost 150 performances. I'm sort of assuming that you all kind of know the basic stories, but if not, then please do say, well, what's all this about?
Could you remind me of the Crucible? I've completely...
The Crucible, absolutely. Well, it is a story based on... Miller went off to Salem, Massachusetts to research the story of the witch hunts from the early colonial period, and became fascinated by the parallels between the witch hunts in Salem at the end of the 17th century and the Red Scare in America in the 1950s, which involved a lot of people that Miller knew from theatre and from the film world. I'll look in more detail later at the parallels and dissimilarities, one particular crucial dissimilarity between the two. But it is essentially the story of a farmer, John Proctor, and his wife, who are caught up in the crazed accusations by various young teenage girls who feel that they've been possessed by witchcraft, and they blame various people in the community, and the witch hunters are called in, and the sort of sense of suspicion and accusation spreads and spreads. So, in a very short nutshell, that's what it is. The View from the Bridge was a return to this work he did on The Hook, that world of the dockers, of the Brooklyn shipyards, and a world but which he was now quite familiar with, to which he adds an element of sexual possessiveness and madness.
Which
and
it's sorry to interrupt,
please.
Which I understood bore some slight resemblance to Arthur Miller's father's affection. Was it for his sister?
Yes, Miller writes in his memoir, you're absolutely right, Miller writes in his memoir, Time Bends, that both he and his father had a rather curious excess of affection for his younger sister. He is very unspecific about whether this took any greater form. It is worth adding there is also another much more tangible skeleton in Miller's closet, which only came to light after his death a few years ago, about the story of his son who was born with Down syndrome. And this was in the 1960s. Attitudes were relatively different, but not that different. At Miller's instigation, the child was institutionalized and kept away from other members of the family. And this caused a brief stir when it came to light after his death. Daniel Day-Lewis, in fact, Miller's son-in-law, married to Miller's daughter Rebecca, was very instrumental in trying to reintegrate, apparently, the son into the family. But this was a rather fascinating issue, which hasn't played much part in Miller criticism as far as I know. In 1956, a year after A View from the Bridge, two huge things happen, which I suppose finally cement the myth of Arthur Miller. One is that he appears before HUAC in Washington. He'd had his passport withdrawn before. He appears before HUAC and refuses, unlike Elia Kazan, unlike many other people, refuses to name names. It's one of the moments, and I suppose if you think of the sort of recent hullabaloo there's been about Harper Lee's novel and its sequel, prequel, whatever it was, Atticus Finch we think of as one of the great sort of figures of integrity of American culture in the 1950s. And in a way, I don't think it is mistaken to think of Arthur Miller in the same way. At that moment, when people were buckling, caving in, naming names, saving their necks, saving their careers, Miller refused to play along. He was at the height of his career, of course, but nevertheless, it was a moment of tremendous moral grandeur. The second thing, and it's not unrelated in some way, is that he marries Marilyn Monroe. And they were married for 5 years. She was the most beautiful woman in America, the most famous film star in America, the most famous film star in the world. He was the most famous playwright in the world. It's not unrelated to his stand against HUAC in the sense that by taking on Miller, you're not just taking on a left-wing American Jewish playwright, you're also taking on the husband of Marilyn Monroe. That is a rather different kind of kettle of fish. He rewrites A View from the Bridge, a revised version, for Peter Brook to produce in London in 1956. In 1957, he is convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to name suspected communists, but no penalty is imposed, and this is reversed by the Supreme Court in 1958. We often think of the McCarthy period as something which sort of happens in the early 50s. It actually rumbled on close till the period of Kennedy. He also writes a short story for Esquire magazine called The Misfits, which we'll return to in a moment. He also publishes his collected plays, and there is the first British television production of Death of a Salesman. In 1961, The Misfits, published as a short story a few years before, is filmed with Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, Montgomery Clift. It's an extraordinary film, and he separates from Monroe and they divorce later that year. Sidney Lumet directs a movie version of View from a Bridge the same year, and his mother dies that year. In 1962, he remarries his third Gentile wife, Inga Morat, Austrian photographer, and they are together for the next 40 years until her death in 2002. They have two children, daughter Rebecca Miller, the writer, and their son Daniel, the one with Down syndrome. Monroe dies also in 1962 from a famous... Well, let's not get into that, but or let's, whichever. I mean, that's entirely up to you in the question and answer session later on. In 1964, there's another significant... So I'm sorry.
Can I just ask a bit more about the relationship with Marilyn Monroe?
Yeah.
Yes,
Other
yes.
than, obviously, a beautiful, famous woman.
Yeah.
But what do you think was behind it? I mean, was there anything to do with McCarthy? Was there anything kind of cynical in the sense...
On his part?
Yes, on his part.
Possibly. I think he was bowled over by her, at least from his memoir Time Bends.
Wasn't she a very needy lady?
She was a very needy lady, and I think...
So bravely stood up to the authorities.
She did. She did.
Which was a brave act.
It was a brave act. She was brave and she was needy. She was a person of many contradictions. I think he realized, at least when he writes his memoir, 25 years later, Time Bends, he describes the first encounter as a moment of really stepping into the abyss, or making a choice. You either step into the abyss or you don't. I think with hindsight, he realized that he had that this was only going to go one way, and it was going to be disastrous for her and for him. Not a subject he was willing to be drawn on in interviews. I produced 2 programs with him, one for radio, one for television. Not something he wanted to go near in his old age. And he, I think, just viewed it with hindsight as a terrible, terrible, unmitigated mistake. I think is the way he would put it. Yes, needy, but he couldn't deal with it. Yes, brave, which he admired. Yes, famous and incredibly beautiful, and very involved in the movie world. And bear in mind, you know, his one main film script, The Misfits, she plays one of the key parts in that.
Who wrote The Misfits, the original short story?
He did. He did, yes. And, you know, perhaps it seemed a sort of obvious mix, a sort of famous actress and a famous playwright. Why not? You know. Well, we know why not. 1964, there comes another turning point. He visits the Mauthausen death camp, covering the Nazi trials in Frankfurt for the New York Herald Tribune, and writes Incident at Vichy. The main question of this play is how the Nazis were able to perpetrate the Holocaust, to answer the question that has haunted people since the war: why did the Jews walk to their deaths? Why was there so little resistance? It is worth noting that it is his first play which in any way addresses the Holocaust. And apart from a later TV play, Playing for Time with Vanessa Redgrave, and of course Broken Glass, which comes along much later in the 1990s, towards the very end of his career, there is very little by him. It is worth noting that, like Saul Bellow, who went to visit the death camps in East Europe at around the same time, 1962, I think, in Bellow's case, American Jewish writers tended not, in the 1950s, late 1940s and 1950s, to address questions about the Holocaust. And this was, in any case, the first time that Miller did. The one exception, the one most obvious exception, is Philip Roth, whose first collection in 1959, Goodbye Columbus, includes the extraordinary story Eli the Fanatic, which is a remarkable coming to terms by an American Jewish writer with the Holocaust and the question of silence and so on. It is worth noting also that 2 plays, he produces another play in 1964 called After the Fall, directed by his old friend Kazan. They had finally made up after the HUAC falling out, with Jason Robards in the main part. Those are his first plays since 1955, since A View from the Bridge. There is a long period which coincides with the Monroe relationship where he just did not produce any plays. He's president of Penn from 65 to 69. His father dies in 66. He writes his first book of short stories in 67, and so on and so on and so on. So the real guts of his career are, I would say, from 47 to about 61, to the Misfits and the breakup with Monroe. It is worth looking at the contexts in which some of these plays were written. As I say, he was a celebrity. He said in a late interview towards the end of his life about his marriage with Monroe, "I'd say out of the 5 years we had 2 good years, but her addiction to pills and drugs defeated me. if there was a key to her despair, I never found it. He was asked, could you write when you were with her? He said, hardly a word. It was impossible. Whether or not it was impossible, the fact is that he didn't write any plays between 1955 and 64, or didn't produce any plays. But nevertheless, it did make him famous in a way that the plays on their own would not. That and HUAC together made him one of the most famous figures in 20th century America. And therefore we're dealing with someone who's rather more than just a literary figure, more than just a playwright. The key thing about these plays and their appeal, I think, is that they are social dramas. Not necessarily political dramas, but social dramas. All My Sons is a play primarily about honesty and moral corruption by an American manufacturer during the Second World War. The death of a salesman engages with the fate of a generation during the Depression. The Crucible, which is the one most political play about the McCarthy period. But there is something more, I think, that this could be described as theatre of the ordinary man. Miller writes in his introduction, I knew my informant's neighbourhood. I knew its middle-class ordinariness. His heroes are ordinary middle-class men and women. Joe Keller, a businessman. Willie Loman, a salesman. John Proctor, a farmer. Eddie Carbone, a longshoreman. Even in his later plays, like Broken Glass, the hero is a sort of lowly corporate white-collar man. The plays focus on family lives. The wives, as was often the case in America in the 1940s and 50s, were housewives. Homes were a suburban family home in All My Sons, the little mortgaged home in Brooklyn, and anyone who's seen Death of a Salesman will know how important the paying off of the mortgage is in that play. The small farming community of Salem in Crucible, the tenement apartments in View from a Bridge. And as ordinary people, they speak the language of ordinary people. They're uneducated mostly. Keller, Loman, Proctor, Carbone. None of them are college men or university men. So they speak ordinary speech, but it's not what you would call realism. And I suppose part of the fascination of 1950s American drama is, and British drama, is the attempt to find something which is realistic, tells the stories of ordinary, recognizable people who, but not entirely in a realistic way.
Would you equate that with kitchen sink dramas in the UK?
Well, I would say that that's a very interesting question.
Could you repeat?
Yes, certainly. The gentleman was asking how similar this is to kitchen sink drama. Now, I think the difference with kitchen sink drama, and I think its limitations in the end, were precisely that it didn't transcend that kind of realism or naturalism, but was sort of confined by its sort of medium. Just as the kitchen sink school of painters in Britain in the 1950s, the so-called Beaux-Arts quartet, they too did not sort of transcend that particular moment. But if you take someone like a contemporary of theirs, who was just beginning to write TV drama at that time, someone like Harold Pinter, he is using very ordinary language to describe very ordinary people in rather extraordinary situations. And I suppose the difference is that in Miller's plays, you've got ordinary people speaking an ordinary language in very ordinary situations. Extreme situations, but nevertheless ordinary situations. Another comparison might be with Tennessee Williams, where you've got sort of, again, ordinary people, maybe slightly crazy, maybe slightly hysterical. The volume has been turned up massively But nevertheless, they're ordinary people. It's another search by another playwright of that period to find a way of combining realism with something else. And what that something else is varies from writer to writer. But quite clearly, whether you look at painting or film or literature or drama in the 1950s, the central question on both sides of the Atlantic, I would argue, and this applies to Miller as much as it applies to any of them, is what does realism allow you to do, and what does realism prevent you from doing? And this question, I would say, is at the heart of all the great artistic work of any medium during that period. To say that, I mean, some, I think, can be just dismissed as just mere naturalism, but an awful lot of the most interesting work of that period really is not to be dismissed as just naturalism. It is trying to do something very interesting, which is very much of that moment. And Miller, part of the appeal, I think, of Miller's work of that time was that it spoke to that kind of moment. Those audiences had a sense when they went to the theatre, when they went to Broadway in the 1950s, that this wasn't just naturalism. There was something else. So, I'm sorry, you had your hand up earlier.
So maybe even with naturalism, people's yearnings in their head, maybe that's what makes them thinking of loneliness and the long-distance runner by Annie Silito. So the head, it can be freer and take people into other areas, but it's out of a longing or yearning.
Absolutely. Because what you have in all these situations is these characters are straining for something more than their life is going to give them. And what we feel, you know, at times you might think with Willy Loman, what an exasperating little schmuck. Lives his life in denial, turns away from his children when they need him the most, turns away from his wife when she needs him the most, lives a lie. You know, what a fool. But the magic of the play is we go away thinking of the humanity of Willy Loman and what he yearns for, and that all he wants, it is so little. And yet we've produced a society that cannot give that to the Willy Lomans of this world. And you look at the longshoremen and the immigrants, the Italian immigrants in A View from the Bridge, or you look at the people in All My Sons, and they're just trying to do the right thing, even when they've done the wrong thing. And of course we condemn them for doing the wrong thing. And the plays are an exquisite Ibsenite analysis of the consequences of doing the wrong thing and the retribution that follows. And yet, we never walk away from All My Sons thinking Joe Keller deserved every bit of what he got. We never walk away from A View from the Bridge. Those who saw the recent production with Mark Strong, you don't walk away from that thinking, what an inhuman little monster, what a little shit. You walk away from it thinking, there but for whatever, go you or I. And that is the universality of Miller's plays and the success of Miller's plays. Miller himself, he wrote a very interesting introduction to this collection of plays from 1958. And you may wonder why I stopped to even mention that there was a collection of plays from 1958. Of course there was a collection of plays. He's had loads of collections of plays. The introduction he wrote, a 52-page essay, is fascinating. It's the most interesting insight into Miller's attitude to his work. And he says some very interesting things in it. And he says at one point, it is the nature of the questions asked and answered rather than the language used, whether verse, ordinary language or colourless prose, that determines whether the style is realistic or non-realistic. That a play is written prosaically does not make it a realistic play, and that the speech is heightened and intensified by imagery does not set it to one side of realism. The other thing about the context of these plays is that Miller is part of a new generation, and it's kind of easy looking back to think, well, you know, he was around forever, he was one of the giants of American drama, end of story kind of thing. But he was part of a very particular moment in American culture, in Jewish American culture in particular, but American culture also, what one might call the changing of the guard that took place after the Second World War. During the 1940s, remember Miller's first Broadway play, The Disaster, was 1944, his first great success was 1947, Death of a Salesman was 49, so he's very much a product of the late 40s, early 50s. So is Saul Bellow, who produces his first two novels, The Dangling Man and The Victim, in the 1940s. So is Norman Mailer, who writes his first, the Harvard Brooklynite, who produces his first novel, The Naked and the Dead, in 1948. So is Joseph Heller, who during this whole period is writing his first debut novel, Catch-22. Something rather dramatic had happened to their previous generation, the 1930s generation. They had died and disappeared, leaving a vacuum in Jewish and American culture. Like Nathaniel West, they had died, or like Delmore Schwartz, they had disappeared into mental illness and drink, or their careers had just hit a brick wall. And so there was a new generation emerging from the war, thinking, what is our place as Jewish American writers in the 20th century? We've been to college, we've read our Joyce, we've read our Ibsen, we've read our Proust, we've read our and we're from these Jewish backgrounds. We know the rhythms of Jewish speech. We know that we've grown up with the rhythms of Yiddish speech from Brooklyn, from the Bronx. What are we going to do with this dual legacy? It's a very complicated legacy, and it's an unprecedented legacy in Jewish literature and in American culture. It is hard to remember how much how gentile 1930s American culture was. Theatre, literature. After the war, this all changes dramatically. For one thing, the old subjects had gone. The immigrant novel was finished. For 40 years, the immigrant novel, the immigrant short story, was at the center of Jewish American writing. Think of classics like Henry Roth's Call It Sleep, or Mike Gold's Jews Without Money. The wonderful writing of women writers like Mary Antin, who published her last piece in 1941, and Anzia Yezierska, who published her last book in 1950. The legislation of the 1920s against immigration had stopped the immigration, and the immigrant novel began to seem old. There was a sense by the 1940s that an old world had passed. There's a great line from Willie Loman. He says, "They massacred the old neighborhood." He spoke for a generation when he said that.
How much of his plays do you think reflects back on his relationship with his parents, his relationship with, or failed relationship with 3 or 4 wives, and
Three. Let's be fair.
Okay, fair. And 3 and his
Yes, and only 2 failed.
children.
That is a very big question. What I'm quite keen to do, I think, is try not to be too biographically reductive. Or rather, let me put it a different way, to see what kinds of answers we get by looking at a cultural context, looking at both the obvious contexts of Mccarthyism and so on, but also the context of the new interest in realism, of looking at the Jewish cultural context of a need for new subjects, facing a whole generation, looking at what Miller had in common, perhaps more with other writers. I'll return, if I may, to questions about his family, and questions about families in his writing, which is not necessarily the same thing. All I wanted to say here was that the old culture of Yiddish, Judaism, the old country tenements and sweatshops was gone. Modernism, American modernism of the 1930s, was gone. It had failed. It had not reached an audience. The writers had failed as individuals in terms of alcoholism, early deaths, and so on. A new generation were looking for something very different. You can see this no better than in two very different artists from Miller, but contemporaries of Miller's. The young Saul Bellow, when he writes Augie March, which is around this very moment when the young Saul Bellow breaks the chains and says, here is a new voice for a new Jewish American generation, and this is what it's going to be. A very different response comes from Mark Rothko, also crucially in these moments, this moment after the war in the 1940s, who begins to develop a whole new way of painting, which is moving away from figurative to something very abstract, which is, again, a different response to the question of ethnic particularism. How Jewish do you want to be? Not at all. I'm going to be as un-Jewish as it's possible to be, and let all the art critics say this is Talmudic, this is that, but I'm not going to have a damn Jew in any of my paintings. And with Bellow, any Jews in Augie March? One or two. But few bits of Yiddish here and there. But basically, nada. Miller, not many Jews going on. They may sound like Jews, and that's what gives them this weird quality. They may sound like Jews, but they're not Jews. The question for the Miller's kind of more interested in is what you might call economic individualism, which is a sort of fancy pants term. But he says in this introduction, Joe Keller's trouble, in a word, is not that he cannot tell right from wrong, but that his cast of mind cannot admit that he personally has any viable connection with his world, his universe, or his society. The fortress which all my sons lay siege to is the fortress of unrelatedness. Don't you have a country? Joe Keller's son, Chris, says to him. Don't you live in the world? I think to him, Keller says, they, the dead pilots, were all my sons. Chris's final speech in All My Sons, and remember, this is his breakthrough play. You can be better. Once and for all, you can know there's a universe of people outside and you're responsible to it. And unless you know that, you threw away your son because that's why he died. It is an astonishing moment of an assertion of how related we all are, that we belong to each other in a society of obligations and responsibilities. This is the moment, 1947, this is the moment of the welfare state in England. This is the moment of the National Health Service in England. This is the moment in America where, under Harry Truman, a Democratic president, you've got the consolidation of the New Deal. Yes, you've got McCarthyism, but you've also got new attitudes to social responsibilities. And Miller, more than anyone, was the playwright who spoke to that new set of questions and assumptions. Willy Loman, his fate is about nothing if it is not about what we think of our fellow human beings. Willy says to Howard, the son who has done so well, unlike his own sons, I'm talking about your father. There were promises made across this desk. You mustn't tell me you've got people to see. I put 34 years into this firm, Howard, and now I can't pay my insurance. You can't eat the orange and throw the peel away. A man is not a piece of fruit. Now pay attention. very naturalistic prose. How many words are there more than, I suppose insurance is probably the longest word in that whole speech. This is not fancy pants English. There are no references to Ibsen or Strindberg or Brecht or Chekhov. This is ordinary language by an ordinary person made into one of the great plays of the 20th century. But it is about the legacy of the New Deal, about individualism versus social democracy. Miller speaks in the introduction to All My Sons of the full loathsomeness of an antisocial action. The fortress of unrelatedness. The crime is seen as having roots in a certain relationship of the individual to society. It is an extraordinary moment because right at the very moment when the American dream is heading down the runway and taking off after years of depression, years of war, suddenly it is about to take off and the American dream at last is here. This is the high point of the American century. And at that very moment, Miller raises a dissenting voice. What about people who don't succeed? What about the failures? What happens to them? What about the people who lie to get ahead, to save their necks? What about the paranoid right and the witch hunters? The manufacturers who kill pilots for $1, the salesmen who are cast off after 30 years, after promises made in this office. What about the decent families broken apart by lies and persecution? It's a kind of voice for the prosecution. At the very moment when you'd think that what America most wants is a feel-good moment, because the economy is booming, society is booming. It's all go. But what Miller wants to address are two kinds of lies. Public lies about the American dream, that under the surface, he says, terrible pressures on working men and their families, and private lies about morality and sex. All our old pretense is ripped away, says John Proctor in The Crucible. We are only what we always were, but naked now, he goes on. Biff, one of Willy Loman's sons, says, we never got told the truth for 10 minutes in this house, and I never got anywhere because you blew me so full of hot air I could never stand taking orders from anybody. Willie says, the door of your life is wide open. Biff, Pop, I'm a dime a dozen and so are you. Willie, I'm not a dime a dozen. I'm Willy Loman and you are Biff Loman. I am not a leader of men, Willie, says Biff, and neither are you. You are never anything but a hard-working drummer who landed in the ash can like all the rest of them. Pop, I'm nothing. I'm nothing, Pop. I'm just what I am, that's all. Will you take that phony dream and burn it before something happens? At the center of all of Miller's greatest plays, and this is true as well of Broken Glass, perhaps more true of Broken Glass, perhaps than any of them, is self-deception, are the costs of living a lie. Joe Keller didn't have flu and was responsible for the deaths of 21 airmen. You've such talent for ignoring things, his son says. I ignore what I gotta ignore, he says. Kate Keller, who cannot admit that her son is dead. Willy Loman, adulterer, as well as the American dream. John Proctor, adulterer. Eddie Carbone. Where do we begin with the problems with Eddie Carbone? I just want to finish with the Holocaust, because I haven't actually said, I mentioned a little bit about the Holocaust with reference to Incident of Vichy 1964. Yes, of course. Sorry, I just wanted to finish with some questions about the Holocaust. Miller's delayed interest, not just Miller's delayed interest, the delayed interest of a generation of Jewish American writers. There's a fascinating correspondence between Cynthia Ozick and Saul Bellow, which was first published in Saul Bellow's recent letters, where she says, what were you thinking? You know, there you are, one of the great Jewish American writers of the 1940s and 50s, and you said not a word. There's that great line from the rabbi, of course, in Eli the Fanatic. News didn't reach Woodington. And you could say, well, news didn't reach Broadway, didn't reach the publishing houses of New York. But there is a counter-argument, which is that the Holocaust is dealt with, that it haunts these works by Miller and perhaps these works by Bellow and others. There's a very good Jewish American critic called Mark Schechner who wrote a few years ago, "The Shoah was a hidden wound, shrouded in darkness and suffered in silence, felt everywhere but confronted virtually nowhere." And what you cannot understand about the Miller plays, what you have to appreciate about them, is the mood and atmosphere of darkness from pretty much the beginning of these plays. The loneliness of the central characters. Willy Loman lives in a neighborhood. We meet one of his neighbors. We meet one member of his family. Eddie Carbone is at the end, completely alone, completely isolated. Always throughout, Miller wrote in this 1958 introduction, the image of a private man in a world full of strangers, a world that is not home nor even an open battlefield, but only galaxies of high promise over a fear of falling. It's not just that their guilty past catches up with them, the lies they have lived, the lies that they've lived in a society built on lies. But there's also something very specifically Jewish, I think, to this moment of isolation from 1947 onwards. Yes, these plays are de-Judaized. We've moved from Jewish subject matter to humanism and to universalism. What kind of man should I be, not what kind of Jew should I be? If you look at pre-war American literature, Jewish American literature, Jewish identity and experience is right at the center of all of it, especially immigrant experience. But from the 1940s, it becomes something else. It's humanism, it's universalism, which is why how un-Jewish All My Sons and Death of a Salesman are. There are no Jews at all, except possibly Mr. Birnbaum, Biff's maths teacher in Death of a Salesman. In Miller's 52-page introduction, there's not a single reference to Jews in it. But there are the Jewish rhythms of speech. What killed? What ice does that cut? What must I be forgiven? I spoiled the both of you? 1950s even more so. Tell me what a man's got to be, says Chris. There's even the strange Christian language, in particularly in All My Sons. And this brings me to the final point that I wanted to mention about HUAC. Of course, The Crucible is so closely, so much an allegory of McCarthyism. But there's one thing that's missing. Because if you look at McCarthyism, what essentially it is, yes, it's the attack of the paranoid Gentile right from the Midwest and the South against Jews. But it is also a civil war between Jews. McCarthyism was largely about the Jewish left. Nathan Abrams, in an essay in the Jewish Quarterly a few years ago, said it was a Jewish trial, talking about the Rosenberg trial. He says it was a Jewish trial. The defense, the prosecution, if it's for me, I'm busy. It was a Jewish trial. The defense, the prosecution, the defendants, and the judge were all Jews. The Rosenberg trial. And Miller doesn't take this on. He also might have done, perhaps what somebody like a younger Philip Roth might have done in the early 50s. He might have said, hang on, there is this whole Christian legacy to American culture in New England, from Harvard, from the witch hunters of Salem to Harvard and so on, to T.S. Eliot. Let's have a look at this, to Henry James. Let's have a look at this. Let's take a Jewish look at that. The 1950s wasn't the time to do that. Miller's a liberal on the side of good and right. There are limits to what he was prepared to say. What if, this is my final question, and then you can ask your questions and make your comments. What if Miller had caved in to HUAC? What if he'd been on the right? What would we have thought of Arthur Miller's reputation coming out of the 1950s then? Let me just leave you that question. Please fire away with your questions. Thank you all for being so patient. Speak to my agent, Judy Trotter, please.
It's far too long.
I agree. I'll see what we can sort out.
I just feel that or perhaps you can let us know, let me know, what was his circle of friends? Were they Jewish or non-Jewish? He married 3 non-Jewish women. I don't feel any sort of Jewishness coming over in any of his work. I feel, in fact, that he kind of wanted to steer away from it.
I think that's a really interesting question. And the contrast, again, with Saul Bellow is very, very interesting. If you read Bellow's letters, you have no doubt of who his friends were. He grew up in Chicago before the war with a bunch of Jewish guys from the old neighborhood, and those were the people who mattered to him for the rest of his life. And yes, he met great writers afterwards, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, John Updike, Roth, whoever. But basically, that was who he was. He was a Jew from the old neighborhood in Chicago. Miller, it is really hard to get a purchase on him. The 2 times I made programs with him, and I only mention this because I think it is relevant to your question, you look really closely into his eyes and you just think, I have no way of connecting with you. I don't know who you are. You look closely into his eyes, and I tell you, when you look on a very close-up of VCU down a television camera, you're looking as close at anybody as you're ever going to do without looking at their dental records. And I really had no idea who he was. I didn't think I liked him. I don't think I liked him. But who he was...
No Jewish soul.
Certainly no Jewish soul. Not what you'd call a mensch, by any means. Sir?
But leading on from what you just said, he was a man of obviously a tremendous moral rectitude, humanitarianism, and yet he treated his mongoloid child, his Down's child, in such a horrible way.
Yes.
What do you think the motivation there was?
I don't know, because he has never said. You know, this only came out after his death. I've not seen any letters or any extracts from his journals about this. I simply have no idea.
I heard last week that Burt Bacharach, who was also Jewish, had a Mongoloid child, and he gave the child away, and the child longed for him and yearned for him and committed suicide eventually.
I hadn't heard that.
Right. Well, I was very interested in that. That's I see this similarity.
I mean, bear in mind that when
the time when people didn't want.
It was a different time. It absolutely was a different time in relations to all forms of mental and physical illness and handicap. Also, the divorces, you know, that was nothing compared to Bellow. That was nothing, and Bellow was nothing compared to Norman Mailer. So, you know, these guys got divorced all the time. It's a really good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer. And anyone who does, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Sir, my heckler friend.
I don't have the answer.
Okay.
You just mentioned about Elia Kazan.
Yes.
Testifying, and you suggested, you asked how we might have felt about Miller had he testified. But we all have, well, most people know, have the view of Elia Kazan that he turned up to be a shit in the end.
Yes.
Because he testified.
Yes.
Would you not suggest or imply that, or even infer from that reaction, that that's what we might have felt about Miller had he testified against him?
I'm afraid, in my weaselly little way, that's exactly what I was trying to infer. But the question is, I suppose, we have an assumption, and this is true of all 20th century art, I think, that all great art is on the side of the angels, politically. Brecht, well, depends on your view of communism, but, you know, there are some interesting exceptions. Céline, T.S. Eliot's anti-Semitism, and these exceptions trouble us a lot, and we're not quite sure what we make of them.
Compartmentalise those for you.
That's exactly what we do. The question, however, is, let's turn this the other way. Let's take the good guys and say, how would we feel about Picasso if Guernica was pro-fascist? What would we say about Arthur Miller if he had caved into HUAC? The examples are legion. Saul Bellow's reputation has been damaged almost irreparably by a rather casual comment he made once about, who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus, or the Proust of the something else, where he was basically saying, look, I'm white, you call me a dead white European male, but, we're the guys who deliver the goods. And, never mind all the others. Where are their war and peace? Where are their crime and punishment? And his reputation has taken a massive hammering as a result of that. And I'm just saying with Miller, it's just, I wonder whether we're rather like with the anxious, worried response to the Harper Lee book. How could she do this to us? How could she take away Atticus Finch, our wonderful, heroic, decent...
She didn't do it.
Well...
She did. There was a bloody publisher.
Well, indeed. But that raises other questions, which we'll perhaps come back to another time. But, we get very worried when our certainties, our moral certainties about art, get shaken up a bit. So, sir.
You didn't mention what he did in the war. Were any of his experiences impacted later on in any of his writings?
He didn't do anything in the war because he'd had serious knee injury as an playing American football, playing high school football, and so he was invalided out of the war, and so he basically spent the time working on various federal theatre projects. Did that upset him? Not to my knowledge, and didn't feed into his writing. Bellow's first novel, The Dangling Man, is about a young man waiting to be called up. Philip Roth returned to the question of serving in the Korean War and injuries and being invalided out and so on a lot. Mailer and Heller, their first great books, perhaps their greatest books in both cases, were about their wartime experiences. So it is interesting, except of course Miller's first great breakthrough work is a war story. But interestingly, he doesn't turn it into a story about airmen and heroism. He turns it into a story about guilt, duplicity, corruption.
Was he guilty about the fact that he didn't take part in the war?
He never said he did. He never said that he felt guilty about it. It was on the public record that he didn't serve. Many of the great American writers didn't serve in the war, some did. So he never sort of said, this was a terrible experience for me, I feel guilty about it with retrospect. He said very little about, for example, linking that to why he may or may not have come to the Holocaust late as a subject. This is what I mean. There is something about his reticence
Humility?
I wouldn't say, well, maybe lack of humility. He had a lot not to be humble about, let's face it. But also, he was just, he was a very reticent kind of guy. There are, someone like Joseph Heller could talk 19 to the dozen. Philip Roth is a wisecracking smartass. But Miller was hard to get into. I've never read a good interview with Miller. I've never read a good profile of Miller.
You wanted perhaps his work to stand as his testament rather than trying to explain. Like Dali never explained his painting.
Yeah,
You don't understand it, puff.
perhaps. And it is interesting that after this really great essay from 1958, where he really does say some fascinating things about his work, none of which are autobiographical in that sense. They're really talking about form and what he owes to Ibsen, what modern tragedy means, what naturalism means. So he just doesn't seem interested in what it is in his life. Going back to the lady's questions earlier about his family and his marriages and his children. Rightly or wrongly. As a person, he's not a writer. The lady asked why I didn't like I found him very difficult. The thing is, if you spend 20 years producing programs with a lot of famous people, you are pleasantly surprised by how some of them are just delightful and decent and generous with their time and interesting and the most stimulating companions you could ever wish to spend time with. And there are others who are absolute ballbusters. And you never quite know when you're walking into a studio which you're going to get. And he wasn't quite at the extreme end of the absolute ballbusters, along with, let's say, Lauren Bacall, to name one or two. But he was up there. He was just, it was like pulling teeth, getting anything out of him.
What were your programs about, these interviews?
These were interviews with him.
One for Radio and
one for BBC, which was a straightforward 40-minute interview called Face to Face, and one was on Start the Week when he was one of the speakers on that at the time of his 80th birthday. He was in London for his 80th birthday. He had, as is well known, a much better reputation here than he did in America. The Americans got bored with him very, very quickly and got tired of him. They felt he was sort of...
in the Sainsbury wing at the UEA.
Yeah. Well, they've got a huge setup at UEA of Miller's work. Christopher Bigsby there is the sort of expert. Yeah, absolutely. And the British have loved Miller and always... Sorry, I will come to you in just one second. We've got endless productions of his play. There was something perhaps very English about watching an Inspector Calls the other night. What a Millerite play that is, Sorry, madam. Oh, Ralph, fire away.
A parochial question. A very committed Jew, I think he was, and a very important American. But what was his attitude to the Jewish community in America, and did he participate at all?
He didn't really, no. I mean, this is another interesting example and sort of comparison. For Bellow, for example, Yiddish literature was very, very important. Translating Gimple the Fool was a very important thing for him. Writing about Shalom Aleichem, very important for him. Speaking at Jewish universities or libraries, very important for him. For Miller, no. He was, I don't say this in a critical way. He was really the classic sort of non-Jewish Jew, somebody who was not religious, he did not write about Israel, he did not write until quite late on about the Holocaust, he did not write very much about Jewish writers. It's interesting that for him the great influence was Ibsen. He didn't think very much about Jewish theatre or other Jewish playwrights in that sense. So I think he was just not very interested.
To be critical of the Jewish establishment.
No, but then I think he was perhaps too old for that, if you see what I mean. He came, I've just been reading Isaiah Berlin's, volume 4 of Isaiah Berlin's letters, which go up to the 1990s, where he becomes increasingly perplexed and worried about the state of Israel and the massacres and the treatment of the Palestinians, and he agonizes over this. Miller, to my way of thinking, that was not something that would have kept him awake at night. He was not concerned. It was not somewhere, it mattered to him a great deal, for example, that there was a production of Death of a Salesman in Beijing. That was very important to him. He went to put on Death of a Salesman in Moscow. Very important to him. There were All My Sons. There was a famous production in Israel in the early 70s, I think.
Also Death of a Salesman.
And Death of a Salesman. Wasn't as important.
He came from a very Jewish background by the sound of it.
Very Jewish background. Boy, was it a Jewish background,
So
yes.
that put him off, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, the fact he married 4 women, but the fourth was successful.
Third was successful.
Sorry,
Yeah.
forgive me.
First was at the beginning.
Shows that
It was a long
he
marriage.
didn't
It
care.
wasn't that long. Sorry, who is to say what is a successful marriage? But, Sorry, anyway, you want to...
I just wanted to say
Yes.
just a few little things. First of all, the idea from the left, and not just the Communist Party, the agendas were a bit different. So being Jewish was part of out of that instinct, out of that fellowship.
Yes.
It was nothing special at the time. I know from my own background, but the Jewishness was secondary to the humanitarian.
Absolutely right.
But also, in spite of himself, he came out of this groundswell of immigrant making good, and the family, and his plays appealed universally, and the notions of family and struggle and survival are all Jewish subjects or Jewish traits or something. So I feel we should, thankfully, he represented the best of Jewish ideals in a way, and every single person would relate, especially to the family wrangles and the yearnings and all that.
And these rhythms of speech, which make the plays such a pleasure to listen to, and so moving, are Jewish rhythms of speech. It's not that they're coming from somewhere else, that's what they are. They're kind of Yiddish rhythms of speech. And also, I think the other thing is one has to bear in mind that this is the reason I sort of focus on this period. The period of his great work, he's a young man. These are plays about battles often between fathers and sons, between a father like Joe Keller and his 2 sons, between Willie Loman and his 2 sons. Willie Loman's sons are sort of Arthur Miller's age when he's writing these plays. He's a young man writing these plays. In 1947, he was 31 when he wrote All My Sons. He was 32, 33 when he wrote Death of a Salesman. That's pretty young still. By the time he gets to be an older man, he kept on producing. Boy, was he prolific. But, we all have our favourites from his older age, The Price, Broken Glass, certainly. There are some wonderful plays, but there is a definite tailing off. And I think what happens with someone like, say, Bellow, is that he too, you're right, that moment in the 50s, for a whole generation, in this country, in that country, really were, they were, humanism and the left were a way of subsuming your Jewishness.
That's right, it was another religion.
It was another religion. However, what happened for many other of these people is that later on in their old age, they return in some way or another to Jewish themes. It might be to Yiddish literature. It might be to reflecting on the Holocaust. It might be to theology. It might be to all kinds of things. But in some way or another, they come back. And I think what is striking about Miller is that, with the exception perhaps of more of a coming to terms of the Holocaust as a subject with Broken Glass, he didn't really come back. He didn't feel there was anything to come back to. And great, bring it in. I think we're in fact coming to an end here, so that's perfectly right. One last question.
I saw something fairly recently about his life with Marilyn Monroe. Did he write it?
No.
And it was brought out, or was it written about it? I can't even remember the title.
No, he didn't write anything. Well, no, he wrote, that's not true, he wrote After the Fall, 1964, which together with Incident at Vichy was put on at the Lincoln Center. And that was a kind of coming to terms with that whole story, and the only time he really turned to it as a sort of literary subject or a dramatic subject. I think for him it was just too dark, it was just too terrible a moment. And there is a way of looking at his story. Sorry,
Was he married as a Jew? Divorced as a Jew? Was he buried as a Jew?
I'm sorry, I don't know what kind of funeral arrangements he had, I'm sorry.
No, I just wondered if he gave any instructions when...
I dare say he did. But again, he lived in, for most of his later life, he lived in rural Connecticut. Yes. He was very good with his hands. He built a wonderful sort of writing studio out in the green rolling greens of Connecticut. It was very different. It was. You could not imagine a more gentile place. And he did choose it, and he bought it 1947 after his first theatrical success. And that was his originally vacation home and then his full-time home. And he moved out of New York, and that was Sorry, sir, one last question.
In his maturity, the other great moral question was that of integration, segregation, the black-white issues in America. Was he involved in any way?
No. And this is, again, one of the reasons why I think in America he felt, the Americans, I wouldn't say fell out of love with him exactly, but I think sort of felt there was something quaint and old-fashioned about him, that he somehow didn't speak to the new generation of the 60s or 70s, or the generation of Mamet and then later Tony Kushner, Angels in America. They just felt he was somehow something from the past, and that there wasn't anything quite to learn, that his formally he was old-fashioned. He did. Well, certainly he did in the 60s, especially, and the 60s and 70s very much so. Bellow, it's interesting, because the America changed so much between this generation that I've been trying to talk about with the kind of issues that they were addressing in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. And then comes, a completely new kind of cultural revolution. And very few people survived the change. Roth did, but by constantly reinventing himself. Heller did to some extent. Mailer did, but that was partly to pay the alimony. So, that's a sort of more complicated issue, really. Miller, I think, kept on writing plays. People kept going to the plays, but there was no love there, somehow. Paderewski, forgotten figure. And I think something sort of significantly broke in his relationship with America.
Because he seems to come up to be apart from society, not within the society.
Yeah.
Somebody with his moral stature would feel he would have to talk about the black-white issue.
Yeah, he didn't. It's just not a subject. There is no whiter writer on the American stage. And I think this, again, for young... And I think women writers and producers and directors felt, actually, all these passive, suffering wives on stage, where are the great heroines? Where are the great female roles?
I think Linda, is it Lohman? Is that her name?
Yes.
I think she's quite a heroine.
Because...
Long-suffering.
Well,
Yes.
yes.
And
Yes.
he seems to lose faith with him.
No, she is admirable in many ways,
I mean,
but
blind, obviously, but a self-deception, if you like.
but it's always fathers and sons,
Yes.
except for in the case of Eddie Carbone with his weird, twisted relationship with Catherine. You know, and that again is somewhat curious, although it did not feel dated remotely, seeing the recent revival.
The two recent revivals of the Anthony Sher and Armstrong, they were remarkable, and the audience was full of young people, and they
Yes.
could receive it brilliantly.
Yes. No, it's an odd mystery that on the whole, I think, particularly in America, the theatrical world sort of feels we've sort of, you know, there isn't what we want there to work with. He was the president of Penn for a long time. He and Harold Pinter were together the two voices of conscience for international playwrights and writers. You know, they went to places like Turkey and they spoke out and they made life very awkward for American ambassadors and, you know, and so on. Because they said, no, this is unacceptable what is going on here. But that was in their public personae rather than in their in their work.
Do you know
but,
if, say, Philip Roth and Arthur Miller had any social intercourse?
No.
No. You
No.
don't know? Or they didn't?
But both I don't know, but I also have no evidence for thinking they did.
Yes.
Roth is an interesting case. Sorry, I'm sorry to overrun, but Roth, just finally, Roth is an interesting case because, of course, he comes back to America after his disastrous marriage with Claire Bloom, after his disastrous experience of living in England, and he comes back to America and writes this extraordinary series of novels about America. He has this sort of American turn, the tetralogy. I Married a Communist, American Pastoral, Sabbath Theatre, and whatever the other one. You know, and in a way that relaunched his career as a sort of he was the human stain, because there he was taking on issues about McCarthyism, taking on issues about race, taking on issues about women, taking on issues about Vietnam veterans. It was all there. It was an extraordinary explosion of great novels, and that was, and I think there was a feeling with Miller. Where did it go? Well, what happened?
He's entitled
Yes.
Yes, ours not the reason why. That was the man.
And I suppose the question is, will there be, and this will be my final word, will there be a sort of return to Miller? Not just reverently, but actually with real, analytically, and with passion, and with saying, yes, this man is a voice for our times.
His themes are universal.
Yes.
They're not political. They're not Jewish. They're not Jewish. They're universal. Yes. That is, I think that's the influence.
That's the way he saw it, and that's the way, I guess, yes. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your patience.